Sometimes a man's heart gets so broken that silence becomes his only friend. Jack Brennan knew that kind of pain when he bought an entire ghost town with his life savings. The place had been empty for 30 years. People said it was haunted. Jack didn't care about ghosts. He just wanted somewhere quiet to live with his old dog Rex. They walked down the dusty street, past broken buildings and empty stores. Rex stopped at an old church and started whining. Inside, under some old wooden benches, they found something hidden. It wasn't gold or money. It was something that made Jack cry for the first time in years. The discovery would change his life forever. What could be in that abandoned church that would bring a tough mountain man to tears? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Brennan had been running from memories for 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. Not that he was counting. The weathered deed papers in his jacket pocket crinkled as he shifted his weight against the truck's tailgate, watching Rex sniff around the abandoned main street of Millbrook. The papers represented more than a property purchase. They were his desperate attempt to buy a piece of peace in a world that had taken everything that mattered. The morning sun cast long shadows between the broken storefronts, painting the ghost town in shades of rust and regret. Jack pulled his worn baseball cap lower over his eyes, the same cap Sarah had bought him for their 10th wedding anniversary. She'd laughed when she gave it to him, saying he looked like a real mountain man in it. That was back when her laughter filled their cabin like music, before the silence swallowed everything whole. Rex trotted back, his graying muzzle lifted toward his master. The old border collie had been Jack's only companion since that terrible February night when the world ended on a patch of black ice. Rex understood grief in the way only animals can, without words, without explanations, just steady presence when the darkness felt too heavy to bear alone. "What do you think, old boy?" Jack asked, scratching behind Rex's ears. "Think we can make a go of this place?" Rex's tail wagged once, a restrained approval that somehow felt like a blessing. The realtor had warned him about Millbrook's reputation. Elderly Mrs. Patterson had clutched her pearls when Jack signed the papers in her cramped office. Her watery blue eyes filled with genuine concern. "Mr. Brennan, I feel obligated to tell you again. Folks around here have stories about that place. Unexplained sounds, strange lights. Most people won't even drive through there after dark." Jack had smiled then, the first real smile he'd managed in months. "Mrs. Patterson, I've got ghosts of my own. A few more won't make much difference." But standing here now in the morning light, surveying his new domain, Jack wondered if he'd made a mistake. The town stretched before him like a collection of broken dreams. The old hotel where he'd spent his first night still groaned with every gust of wind. Paint peeled from weathered siding like dead skin, and several roofs had collapsed under decades of mountain winters. Yet something about the place called to him, a kinship between abandoned things. He remembered the newspaper ad that had caught his attention in Murphy's General Store back in Cedar Ridge. Historic mining town for sale, Millbrook, Colorado, complete with buildings, mineral rights, and stories. Serious inquiries only. The asking price had been laughably low, which should have been his first warning. But Jack hadn't been looking for a good investment. He'd been looking for an escape. His mountain cabin had become a prison of memories. Sarah's coffee mug still sat by the kitchen sink. Emma's drawings covered the refrigerator door, held in place by magnets shaped like farm animals. Her favorite book, The Secret Garden, remained open on the nightstand where she'd left it that final evening. Every corner of that cabin whispered their names, and Jack had finally reached the point where whispers felt like screams. The drive to Millbrook had taken him through landscapes that shifted from alpine forests to high desert, from snow-capped peaks to red rock formations that glowed like embers in the afternoon sun. Rex had ridden shotgun with his head out the window, enjoying the freedom of the open road in a way that reminded Jack of better times. They'd stopped frequently, partly for Rex's aging joints, but mostly because Jack wasn't in any hurry to arrive at his new reality. Now, walking down Millbrook's main street with Rex at his side, Jack tried to imagine what this place had been like in its heyday. The bones of prosperity were still visible beneath the decay. A blacksmith shop with its anvil still mounted on a tree stump. A general store with shelves that once held everything from flour to hardware. A saloon with batwing doors that hung at awkward angles, creaking in the morning breeze. But it was the church at the end of the street that drew his attention most. Unlike the other buildings, it seemed to have weathered the decades with more dignity. Its white paint had faded to grey, and one of the front steps had rotted through, but the basic structure appeared sound. The bell tower still reached toward the sky like a prayer cast in wooden nails. Rex had been watching him study the church, and now the dog trotted ahead, his tail wagging with more enthusiasm than Jack had seen in weeks. The old collie sniffed around the church steps, then looked back at Jack with an expression that seemed almost urgent. "You want to check it out, boy?" Rex barked once, his yes bark, and Jack found himself following his dog toward the church door. The brass handle had turned green with age, but it still functioned. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the empty interior. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of colored light streaming through stained glass windows that had somehow survived the years intact. The wooden pews sat in neat rows, some damaged by weather that had found its way through gaps in the roof, but most still solid enough to hold the weight of congregants who would never return. A simple wooden cross hung behind the altar, its surface darkened with age, but carved with obvious care. Jack felt something stir in his chest as he stood in that quiet space. He hadn't been inside a church since the funerals, hadn't felt any desire to speak to a God who had allowed his family to die while he was home fixing a leaky faucet, oblivious to the storm that was claiming everything he loved. But this place felt different somehow, less about religion and more about simple human hope. Rex had disappeared between the pews, his nose to the floor, following some scent that Jack couldn't detect. The dog moved with purpose, weaving between the benches toward the front of the church. He stopped at the third pew from the altar, whining softly and pawing at something beneath the seat. "What is it, Rex?" "What did you find?" Jack knelt beside his dog, running his hands along the underside of the wooden bench. His fingers found a loose board that shifted when he pressed against it. Behind it was a small, hollow space, and inside that space was a wooden box about the size of a cigar box, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth. Jack's hands trembled as he lifted the box from its hiding place. The wood was carved with simple flower patterns, the kind of patient work someone might do during long winter evenings. A small brass latch held it closed, and when Jack pressed the catch, the lid opened with the softest whisper. Inside, nestled in faded silk, was a collection of items that spoke of a child's treasures. A small music box with a dancing ballerina, its pink tutu faded to the color of old roses. Beneath it, a handful of photographs, their edges soft with age. Letters tied with a blue ribbon that had once been bright but now resembled the sky before dawn. And at the bottom, a small leather journal with Lucy written on the cover in a child's careful handwriting. Jack's vision blurred as he lifted the music box with shaking hands. When he wound the tiny key, it played a melody he recognized, Für Elise, the same piece Sarah used to play on the old upright piano in their living room. The same song Emma had been learning before. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Emma at the piano bench, her small fingers stumbling over the keys, her tongue poking out in concentration. Sarah behind her, patient and encouraging, her hands guiding Emma's through the difficult passages. The music filling their home with warmth and possibility. Jack set the music box down carefully and opened the journal. The first entry was dated December 15th, 1955, written in a girl's precise cursive. "Mama says we might be stuck here for Christmas because of the snow. I don't mind. The church is warm and Papa found some candles. He says we're pioneers now, like the people in my books. I hope the storm stops soon, though. I miss our house." As Jack read, Rex settled beside him with a contented sigh, as if he knew his work here was done. Through the stained glass windows, the afternoon light began to fade, but Jack barely noticed. He was lost in the words of a little girl who had faced a long-ago winter with courage and hope, never knowing that her story would someday provide comfort to a broken man and his faithful dog in a ghost town that had been waiting 30 years for someone to care about its secrets. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in Millbrook's abandoned buildings. But inside the church, surrounded by the gentle presence of old sorrows and older love, Jack Brennan began the slow work of learning how to breathe again. Jack spent the night reading Lucy's journal by the light of a battery-powered lantern. Rex curled at his feet in the old hotel room he'd claimed as temporary quarters. Each entry painted a picture of a family caught in circumstances beyond their control, their love for each other shining through even the most frightening moments. December 16th, 1955. The snow is so deep now we can't see out the windows. Papa tried to dig a path to the general store but had to come back. He says not to worry, that people know we're here and will come for us when the storm passes. Mama made soup from the cans we found. It tasted like Christmas. December 18th, 1955. Mama coughed all night. Papa gave her his coat and slept by the door to keep the cold out. I shared my blanket with both of them. We played word games to stay warm. Mama taught me a new song. December 20th, 1955. Papa says we need to be very quiet and very still to save our strength. Mama can barely talk now, but she still hums my favorite lullaby. I put my hands on her chest to feel the music. It makes me feel safe. The final entries were harder to read, chronicling the family's growing desperation as the blizzard raged on. Lucy's handwriting became shaker, her words more sparse, but her love for her parents never wavered. The last entry, dated December 23rd, was barely legible. Papa says the angels are coming to take us home for Christmas. I can hear them singing. Mama says not to be afraid. I'm not afraid. We'll always be together. Jack closed the journal, his eyes burning with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed since the funeral. Rex lifted his head, sensing his master's distress, and placed his graying muzzle on Jack's knee. The simple gesture of comfort nearly undid him completely. They were just a little girl and her parents. Rex, just a family trying to survive. The music box sat open on the nightstand beside him, its tiny ballerina frozen mid-spin in the lamplight. Jack wound it again, listening to the haunting melody fill the empty hotel room. As the notes drifted through the darkness, he could almost hear Sarah's voice humming along, could almost see Emma's small fingers moving across invisible keys. That's when he heard it, a sound so soft he might have imagined it. Footsteps in the hallway outside his room, light and quick like a child's. Rex's ears perked up and a low whine escaped his throat, not of fear but of recognition. Jack held his breath, listening. The footsteps paused outside his door, then continued down the hall toward the stairs. After a moment of silence, he heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere below. "Did you hear that, boy?" Rex's tail thumped against the floor once, confirming what Jack already knew in his heart. They weren't alone in Millbrook. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp mountain morning that made everything seem possible. Jack made coffee on his camp stove and shared half his breakfast sandwich with Rex before venturing back to the church. Something had changed during the night. The building seemed less abandoned somehow, as if the act of discovering Lucy's treasures had awakened something that had been sleeping. Rex led the way again, but this time his behavior was different. Instead of the urgent searching of yesterday, he moved with calm purpose, his tail wagging as if greeting old friends. He went directly to the spot where they'd found the box, then looked up at Jack with bright, intelligent eyes. "You want me to look for more, don't you?" Rex barked his yes bark and began sniffing around the base of the altar. Jack followed his dog's lead, running his hands along the worn wooden boards. Near the corner where the wall met the floor, his fingers found another loose board. This one concealed a larger space, and inside was a bundle wrapped in what had once been a white cloth. Jack unwrapped it carefully, revealing more photographs and a collection of letters tied with different-colored ribbons. The photographs showed the Hartwell family in happier times, posed portraits and candid moments that spoke of deep affection. Thomas Hartwell was a tall man with kind eyes and calloused hands, clearly a labourer who took pride in his work. Margaret Hartwell was petite and graceful, with the sort of gentle smile that suggested she found joy in simple things. And Lucy, sweet Lucy with her dark braids and gap-toothed grin, clutching a doll that appeared in several of the pictures. The letters were addressed to various people, family members, friends, business associates, all dated in the days before the blizzard, all expressing excitement about Christmas plans that would never come to pass. One letter, in Margaret's careful script, was addressed to her sister in Denver. "Dearest Ruth, Thomas has found work with the railroad company, and we're so hopeful about our future here in Millbrook. Lucy loves the school and has made fast friends with the other children. The mountains are more beautiful than I ever imagined, though Thomas warns me the winters can be harsh. We're planning a lovely Christmas celebration this year. Lucy is so excited she can barely sleep. Give our love to everyone, and know that we think of you daily with such fondness." As Jack read letter after letter, a picture emerged of a family full of hope and plans, unaware that their story was about to end in tragedy. The weight of their lost future pressed against his chest like a physical thing. That's when he found it. Tucked beneath all the other papers was a small wooden object that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a music box, smaller than Lucy's but carved from the same type of wood. When he wound it, it played the same melody, Für Elise. The music seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, echoing off the church walls with an otherworldly resonance. As the notes faded, Jack heard something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, the sound of a child's laughter, clear and joyful, coming from somewhere deeper in the church. Rex's entire body went rigid with attention, but his tail never stopped wagging. He looked between Jack and the source of the laughter as if trying to communicate something important. Then, without warning, he trotted toward the back of the church, where a narrow door led to what Jack assumed was a storage room or office. The laughter came again, closer this time, accompanied by what sounded like a woman's voice, soft and comforting, speaking words Jack couldn't quite make out. Rex whined at the closed door, pawing at it gently. Jack's hands shook as he turned the doorknob. The door swung open to reveal a small room that had once served as the minister's office. A simple desk sat against one wall, covered with papers that had somehow remained undisturbed by time and weather. Bookshelves lined the other walls, still holding volumes of sermons and theological texts, but it was what sat on the desk that took Jack's breath away. A third music box, this one clearly handmade, with For Our Darling Lucy, Christmas 1955 carved into its lid. Inside, nestled in red velvet, was a small silver locket on a delicate chain. As Jack lifted the locket, the room filled with the scent of pine needles and cinnamon, the unmistakable smell of Christmas morning. The laughter came once more, fainter now but unmistakably happy, as if expressing gratitude for his discovery. Jack opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside was a tiny photograph of the Hartwell family, all three of them smiling at the camera with the kind of uninhibited joy that only comes from being completely loved. Opposite the photo, in the finest engraving he'd ever seen, were the words, "Love never dies." That's when the tears finally came, not just for the Hartwell family, but for his own losses, for Sarah and Emma, for all the Christmases that would never be, for all the laughter that had been silenced too soon. He wept for the music box that would never be given, for the little girl who would never grow up, for parents who died trying to keep their child warm and safe. Rex pressed against his legs, offering the only comfort he could, while somewhere in the silence of the abandoned church, Jack Brennan began to understand that some bonds are too strong for death to break. The drive to Cedar Ridge took Jack 45 minutes down winding mountain roads that carved through stands of aspen and pine. Rex rode beside him in comfortable silence, occasionally lifting his nose to catch scents carried through the open window. Jack had wrapped the Hartwell family photograph carefully in his jacket, treating it like the precious artifact it had become. The Cedar Ridge Public Library occupied a brick building that had probably been grand in its day, but now showed the wear of small-town budgets and harsh mountain winters. Inside, the smell of old books and furniture polish created an atmosphere of quiet reverence that reminded Jack of churches, fitting, since he'd come here seeking a different kind of truth. Martha Henley had been the head librarian for 37 years, according to the nameplate on her desk. She was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. When Jack approached her desk with the photograph in his hands, her expression shifted from helpful to wary. "I'm looking for information about a family that lived in Millbrook," Jack said, placing the photograph carefully on her desk. "The Hartwells. This would have been taken sometime in 1955. Martha's face went pale as she looked at the image. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the photograph, studying the faces with the intensity of someone seeing ghosts. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the old church in Millbrook. I'm Jack Brennan. I bought the town last week." Martha set the photograph down as if it had burned her fingers. "Mr. Brennan, there are some stories that are better left buried." "This family deserves better than being forgotten," Jack replied, surprised by the protective edge in his own voice. "They were real people with real lives. I'd like to know what happened to them." Martha studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity against decades of silence. Finally she sighed and removed her glasses, cleaning them with movements that spoke of nervous habit. "I was 23 when the Hartwells disappeared," she said. "Just married, working part-time at the old newspaper office in town. Everyone knew something terrible had happened during that blizzard, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Bad for business, they said. Good for the town's reputation." She led him to a corner table, surrounded by tall windows that looked out on the main street. From a locked filing cabinet, she produced a manila folder, thick with yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "I've been collecting information about Millbrook for decades," Martha explained. "Call it professional curiosity or maybe guilt." The official story was that the Hartwell family simply vanished during the Christmas blizzard of 1955. Search parties looked for them when the weather cleared, but they never found any trace. Jack opened the folder and immediately saw Lucy's face staring back at him from a newspaper clipping dated January 5th, 1956. "Local. Family missing after storm," read the headline. The article was brief and frustratingly vague, mentioning only that the family had last been seen in Millbrook before the blizzard struck. "There's more," Martha said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "My husband Walter was part of the search party. Before he died, he told me things that never made it into the newspapers. They did find the family, Mr. Brennan. They found them in the church, just like you probably figured out from whatever you discovered there." Jack's hands stilled on the papers. "What happened to them?" "They died from exposure and starvation. The whole family huddled together near the altar, trying to stay warm. Walter said it was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. Parents who had clearly given everything to try to keep their little girl alive." Martha's voice broke slightly. Lucy was wrapped in both her parents' coats. They died protecting her, but it wasn't enough. The silence stretched between them as Jack processed this information. Part of him had known, of course. Lucy's journal entries had painted a clear picture of their deteriorating situation. But hearing it confirmed made the tragedy feel immediate and real. Why wasn't this reported? Jack asked. "Money and politics," Martha said bitterly. The town council was terrified that news of a family dying in Millbrook would scare away potential residents and investors. The railroad was already pulling back, and the mine was showing signs of playing out. They convinced everyone that keeping quiet was for the greater good. She pulled out another clipping, this one from a Denver newspaper dated several weeks later. The family was listed as missing persons, presumed dead. Their relatives in Denver held memorial services, never knowing that their loved ones had actually been found. Jack stared at the memorial notice, feeling anger build in his chest like a slow-burning fire. Thomas Hartwell, 34, Margaret Hartwell, 31, Lucy Hartwell, 9, survived by relatives who had spent decades wondering what happened to them. Where are they buried? Jack asked. Martha's silence answered him before she spoke. Walter said they buried them behind the church quietly at night. No markers, no ceremony. They told themselves it was temporary, that they'd move the bodies and do things properly once the town stabilized. But Millbrook never stabilized, did it? The railroad left, the mine closed, and everyone scattered. The people who knew the truth either died or moved away, and the secret died with them. Except you, Jack said. Except me. And now you. Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Walter never got over being part of that cover-up. He said he could hear that little girl crying on windy nights, and I believe he could. Some wrongs don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. Jack spent the rest of the afternoon going through Martha's research, piecing together the Hartwell family's story. Thomas had been a railroad worker, skilled and dependable, with hopes of advancing to a supervisory position. Margaret had taught piano lessons and dreamed of starting a small music school in Millbrook. Lucy had been bright and curious, beloved by her teacher and classmates alike. They had been, by all accounts, exactly the kind of family that small towns are built on, hard-working, optimistic, invested in their community's future. Their death should have been mourned, their sacrifice honored, their memory preserved. Instead, they had been erased from history as if they had never existed. As the afternoon light began to fade, Martha walked Jack to the library entrance. "What will you do with this information?" she asked. Jack looked down at the photograph in his hands, at Lucy's bright smile and her parents' protective postures. "I don't know yet, but they deserve better than an unmarked grave and 60 years of silence." Martha nodded approvingly. "Walter would have liked you, Mr. Brennan. He always said someone would come along eventually who cared enough to set things right." Driving back to Millbrook as the sun set behind the mountains, Jack found himself talking to Rex about what he'd learned. The old dog listened with the patient attention that had gotten Jack through the worst days after Sarah and Emma's death. They were just trying to survive, Rex. Just like we are. Just like everyone is, I guess. Jack's voice grew thick with emotion. That little girl died believing her parents would keep her safe. And they tried, boy. God knows they tried. Rex whined softly and placed his paw on Jack's arm, a gesture of comfort that somehow seemed to come from more than just one old dog's intuition. They reached the outskirts of Millbrook. Jack could have sworn he heard music drifting on the evening breeze, faint but unmistakable. Für Elise played on what sounded like a piano that existed somewhere between memory and dreams. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Jack hadn't experienced since before his world collapsed. He would wake with the sun, make coffee on his camp stove, and spend his mornings exploring Millbrook building by building, Rex always at his side. The old dog seemed to have a sixth sense about where to look, leading Jack to discoveries that painted an increasingly detailed picture of the Hartwell family's final days. In the general store, beneath the loose floorboard near the counter, they found evidence that the family had taken shelter there initially, blankets that still smelled faintly of wool and cedar. Empty tin cans that had once held soup and vegetables. Thomas had carved his initials in the wooden counter, along with Margaret's and Lucy's, as if claiming a small piece of permanence in an impermanent world. But it was in the old boarding house that they made the discovery that changed everything for Jack. Rex had been sniffing around the kitchen area when his whining drew Jack's attention to a cabinet that seemed oddly positioned. When Jack moved it aside, he found something that made his breath catch. Carved into the wall behind it, at child height, was a simple wooden cross no bigger than his palm. Jack traced the rough edges with his finger, imagining small hands working patiently with whatever tool Lucy had found to create this symbol of faith. Below the cross, in letters that had been carved with obvious difficulty, were the initials LH and a date. Dec 21, 1955, 2 days before the final journal entry. 2 days before the angels came to take them home. She was still hoping, Jack whispered to Rex, who had settled beside him with unusual stillness. Even at the end, she was still believing everything would be all right. The cross became a talisman for Jack, a reminder of courage in the face of the unknown. He carefully removed it from the wall, intending to keep it safe with the other treasures he'd found. But that night, as he sat in his hotel room reading more of Martha's research, something extraordinary happened. Jack had fallen asleep in the chair beside his window, Lucy's journal open in his lap. He dreamed of snow falling outside a warm kitchen, of a woman humming while she cooked, of a child's laughter mixing with the sound of wind in the eaves. In the dream, he wasn't an observer, but somehow part of the scene, welcomed into a family's intimate moments of love and routine. He woke to Rex's gentle whining and the sound of music, not from a music box this time, but from somewhere deeper in the hotel. Piano music, played with the tentative touch of someone still learning. Für Elise, but with the occasional stumble and restart that spoke of a young student's determination to get it right. Jack followed the sound down the hotel's main staircase, Rex padding silently beside him. The music led them to what had once been the hotel's parlor, where an old upright piano sat against the far wall. In the moonlight streaming through tall windows, Jack could see that the piano bench was pulled out as if someone had just been sitting there. As he watched, transfixed, one of the keys depressed by itself, producing a single, clear note that hung in the air like a question. Then another key and another, until the melody resumed, halting, childlike, but filled with such hope that Jack felt tears spring to his eyes. Rex's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. The old dog approached the piano as if greeting someone, his whole body wiggling with the joy of recognition. He sat directly in front of the bench, looking up at empty air, with the same expression he used to give Emma when she played her own halting versions of simple songs. "Lucy?" Jack whispered, and the music paused as if the player had heard him. For a moment the silence was complete, except for the sound of Jack's heartbeat in his ears. Then, so softly he might have imagined it, came the sound of a child's voice, sweet and clear. "Thank you for finding me." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like an echo that had been waiting 60 years to be heard. Jack sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. He had spent 3 years learning to live with loss, but he had never imagined that love could reach across such a vast distance. "We're going to take care of you," he said to the empty room, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "All of you. I promise." The piano keys moved again, this time playing a melody Jack didn't recognize, something simple and sweet that might have been a lullaby. As the last notes faded, he could have sworn he heard other voices joining in, adult voices that harmonized with the child's in a song that spoke of comfort and protection. Rex remained at attention throughout the entire encounter, his ears perked and his tail moving in rhythm with the invisible family's presence. When the music finally stopped, he looked back at Jack with eyes that seemed to say, "You understand now, don't you?" Jack did understand, at least partially. The Hartwell family hadn't simply died in Millbrook. They had remained, waiting for someone who would care enough to acknowledge their story. And somehow, his own grief had made him the right person to hear their voices across the years. The next morning brought a return to practical concerns. But they felt different now, imbued with purpose beyond Jack's own healing. He drove to Cedar Ridge again, this time to visit the county courthouse and research property records, burial permits, and any other official documentation that might have survived from 1955. The clerk, an efficient woman named Janet, was initially helpful, but grew increasingly uncomfortable as Jack's questions became more specific. When he asked about burial records for December 1955 through January 1956, she claimed that many of those documents had been lost in a fire years earlier. "What about death certificates?" Jack pressed. "I'm sorry, but if there's no record of burial permits, then there probably aren't death certificates either," Janet said, avoiding his eyes. "You might try the state archives in Denver, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." Jack left the courthouse with the distinct impression that some silences had been carefully maintained for decades. But he also left with something else, a copy of the original property deed for the Millbrook Church, which listed Thomas Hartwell as one of the founding trustees. The family hadn't just died in that building. They had helped build it, had invested their hopes and faith in creating something that would outlast them. That evening, as Jack sat in the church reading by lamplight, the carved cross warm in his palm, he felt the presence of the family around him like a gentle embrace. They weren't haunting Millbrook, they were protecting it, waiting for someone to complete their interrupted story. And Jack Brennan, a man who had forgotten how to hope, found himself planning how to give 3 souls the recognition and peace they deserved. 3 weeks into his residency in Millbrook, Jack had established routines that kept him anchored to the living world, while he navigated increasingly frequent encounters with the dead. Each morning, he would check on Rex, whose age seemed to be catching up with him more quickly since their arrival. The old dog moved more slowly now, but with greater purpose, as if he understood that time was running short for whatever work they had come here to do. It was during one of these morning check-ins that Martha arrived unannounced, her small Honda struggling up the dirt road that led into town. Jack watched from his hotel window as she parked and sat for several minutes, gathering courage for whatever had brought her here. When she finally emerged from the car, she carried a manila envelope thick with documents. "I've been having dreams," she said without preamble when Jack met her at the hotel entrance. "About Walter, about the Hartwell family. He keeps telling me it's time to tell you everything." They sat in the hotel parlor where Jack had heard Lucy play piano, Martha's hands shaking slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside were pages that looked like they had been torn from a medical journal, the edges yellowed and brittle with age. "These belonged to Dr. Morrison," Martha explained. "He was the town doctor back then and Walter's brother-in-law. When Dr. Morrison died in 1987, his widow gave these to Walter. Said she couldn't stand to keep them anymore." Jack began reading, his stomach clenching as the truth unfolded in clinical language that couldn't mask the horror beneath. The pages were Dr. Morrison's private notes about the discovery of the Hartwell family, written in the careful script of a man trying to document something he wished he'd never seen. December 28, 1955. Search. Party found the Hartwell family in the abandoned church at approximately 2:30 p.m. All 3 deceased. Apparent cause exposure and malnutrition. Bodies positioned in protective formation, parents shielding child. Evidence suggests survival period of 8-10 days post-blizzard onset. The clinical language continued, but between the lines Jack could read the doctor's anguish. Thomas and Margaret had stripped themselves of layers, wrapping their clothing around their daughter. They had given her what little food they could scavenge, slowly starving while keeping her alive as long as possible. The final entry was barely legible, as if Dr. Morrison's hand had been shaking as he wrote, "The child showed signs of having survived longest. Parents appear to have died approximately 24-48 hours before her. She was found clutching a wooden cross. Carved marks on church wall suggest she maintained faith until the end. This level of parental sacrifice defies medical understanding of survival instincts. Cannot recommend public disclosure. Sight too disturbing for community morale." Jack set the pages down, his vision blurred by tears of rage and grief. They were alive when the search parties first looked for them. Walter always believed so, Martha confirmed. He said the first searches were half-hearted, more for show than anything else. Nobody really expected to find them alive after that blizzard, so nobody looked hard enough. And afterward, Martha's face hardened with decades of accumulated guilt and anger. The town council met in emergency session. Mayor Franklin, Councilman Roberts, Judge Hawthorne, they made the decision together. The bodies were buried behind the church on December 30th, just before New Year's. No ceremony, no marker, no official record. Dr. Morrison was sworn to secrecy, told it was for the greater good of the community. Jack stood and walked to the parlor window, looking out at the ghost town that stretched before him like a collection of broken promises. The greater good. As if 3 lives could be sacrificed on the altar of economic anxiety. "There's more," Martha said quietly. She handed him another document, this one a letter written in Dr. Morrison's careful script, dated January 15th, 1956, and addressed to his brother in Chicago. "Dear William," the letter began, "I write to you as both physician and human being, seeking counsel for actions that weigh heavily on my conscience. 3 weeks ago, I was party to a decision that violated every principle of medicine and decency I have ever held sacred." The letter detailed the cover-up, Dr. Morrison's growing torment over his role in it, and his fear that the dead family would never find peace. But it was the final paragraph that made Jack's hands tremble. "The strangest aspect of this entire tragedy is that I continue to hear them. Not voices precisely, but sounds. A child's laughter, piano music, footsteps in empty buildings. Walter claims he experiences the same phenomena, as do several other members of the search party. We tell ourselves it's guilt manifesting as auditory hallucination, but the sounds are too specific, too joyful to be products of our tormented consciences. It's as if the family remains in Millbrook, waiting for someone to acknowledge their presence and grant them the recognition they were denied in death." Jack looked up at Martha, whose own eyes were bright with tears. "How many people knew about the cover-up?" "Maybe a dozen at most." "About the other things?" "Nearly everyone who spent time in Millbrook after that winter. But people don't talk about things that make them uncomfortable. They rationalize, they explain away, they convince themselves they imagined it all. But you didn't. No, I didn't. And neither did Walter until the day he died. He made me promise to watch for someone who would care enough to do what we should have done 60 years ago. Martha reached across and squeezed Jack's hand. "Someone like you." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through every document in Martha's collection, building a complete picture of the conspiracy that had erased the Hartwell family from history. Bank records showed that several town council members had received consulting fees from railroad and mining interests in the months following the cover-up, payments that looked suspiciously like rewards for keeping Millbrook's reputation intact. As evening approached and Martha prepared to leave, she paused at the hotel entrance. "There's something else you should know. The land behind the church, it's not just where they buried the Hartwells. It's where they buried everyone who died in Millbrook without family to claim them. Drifters, miners who died in accidents, people who just disappeared into the mountains. There might be a dozen graves back there, maybe more." Jack felt the weight of that revelation settle over him like a shroud. A dozen souls, maybe more, forgotten and unmarked. Their stories lost to time and indifference. "I know it seems overwhelming," Martha continued, "but Walter always said you'd know what to do when the time came." After she left, Jack sat in the gathering darkness of the parlor, Rex at his feet and Lucy's wooden cross in his palm. The piano remained silent, but he could feel presences gathering around him. Not just the Hartwell family now, but others. Souls who had been waiting decades for someone to care about their forgotten lives. The magnitude of what he was contemplating frightened him. But for the first time since Sarah and Emma's death, Jack Brennan felt a purpose larger than his own grief, a calling that connected his personal healing to something that mattered beyond himself. The search for the graves began at dawn 3 days later. Jack had spent the intervening time preparing, purchasing a metal detector from a pawn shop in Cedar Ridge, gathering tools, and steeling himself for what he might find. Rex moved slowly that morning, his breathing more labored than usual, but he insisted on accompanying Jack to the area behind the church. The ground was uneven and overgrown with scrub oak and wild grass that had been undisturbed for decades. Jack methodically worked his way across the area, following the metal detector's signals and Rex's increasingly excited behavior. The old dog seemed to sense where to dig before the machine even registered anything, his nose leading them to spots that yielded fragments of metal, belt buckles, buttons, a simple wedding ring that had been worn thin with years of wear. It was Rex who found the first grave marker. The dog had been sniffing around what appeared to be a natural depression in the earth when he began digging with unusual vigor. Jack knelt beside him and brushed away decades of accumulated dirt and leaves to reveal a flat stone about the size of a dinner plate. Carved into its surface in crude but careful letters were the words, TML Hartwell, Together Forever, Deck 1955. Jack sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the simple dignity of the marker. Someone, Dr. Morrison perhaps, or one of the other men who had participated in the secret burial, had taken the time to create this small monument. It wasn't much, but it was something, a gesture that proved at least one person had been unwilling to let the family disappear completely. They didn't forget you, Jack whispered, running his fingers over the carved letters. Someone remembered. Rex whined softly and moved to another spot about 10 feet away where he began digging again. This time Jack found a marker that simply read Unknown 1952, carved in the same rough style. A third marker bore the name James Walsh, age 19, 1949, while a fourth showed only Child of God 1953. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they had found markers for 11 graves. Each stone told a story of someone who had died far from family, forgotten by time, but remembered by whoever had taken the trouble to mark their resting places. The Hartwell family's marker was the most elaborate, but each stone had been carved with obvious care, as if the unknown monument maker had understood that every life deserved acknowledgement. That afternoon, Jack sat in the church with the markers arranged before him like a congregation of the forgotten. Rex lay beside him, panting heavily from the morning's exertions, his grey muzzle resting on crossed paws. The supernatural presences that had become part of Jack's daily experience felt stronger now, as if the discovery of the markers had somehow validated their existence. As he studied the stones, trying to imagine the lives they represented, the air around him began to shimmer with an energy that was almost visible. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and Jack's breath formed small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Rex lifted his head, his tail moving weakly but persistently. That's when they appeared, not as solid figures, but as impressions of light and shadow that his mind could barely process. Jack counted at least 8 distinct presences gathered in the pews around him, their forms shifting and uncertain, but their emotions unmistakably real. Gratitude washed over him in waves, along with a profound sense of peace that made his eyes water with its intensity. Lucy's presence was the strongest, appearing near the altar as a shimmer of golden light that pulsed with childlike joy. Beside her, the larger shadows that must be her parents radiated protective love and deep satisfaction. The other presences were more difficult to distinguish, but each carried its own emotional signature. Loneliness transformed into fellowship, despair replaced by hope. "You found us all," came a voice that might have been Lucy's, or might have been the collective whisper of all the forgotten souls. "We've been waiting so long to be remembered." Jack tried to speak, but found his throat too tight with emotion. Instead, he reached for the wooden cross that had become his constant companion, holding it up so that all the presences could see it. "I want to do more," he finally managed. "You deserve more than hidden graves and secret stones." The golden shimmer that was Lucy seemed to brighten, and suddenly the church filled with music, not from the piano this time, but from voices raised in harmony. It was a hymn Jack didn't recognize, something old and sweet that spoke of eternal rest and divine love. The other presences joined in, creating a chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As the music faded, Jack heard footsteps outside the church, real footsteps belonging to someone very much alive. Rex's ears perked up, and he struggled to his feet with obvious effort. Through the stained glass windows, Jack could see a figure approaching the church entrance. The door opened to reveal Martha, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood 3 people Jack had never seen before. An elderly man leaning on a walking stick, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, and a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to the photograph of Thomas Hartwell. "Mr. Brennan," Martha said, her voice slightly breathless, "I'd like you to meet some people who've been waiting a long time to talk to you. This is Eleanor Walsh, James Walsh's sister. She's been looking for her brother for over 70 years. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the marker stones Jack had arranged. When she saw the one bearing her brother's name, she pressed her hand to her mouth and began to cry, not tears of sorrow, but of relief so profound it filled the church with its own kind of sacred energy. "He was only 19, she whispered. "He came west to find work in the mines, and we never heard from him again. Our parents died, not knowing what happened to their youngest son." The elderly man with the walking stick introduced himself as Robert Morrison, Dr. Morrison's grandson. "My grandfather left instructions in his will about what to do if someone ever came asking about Millbrook. He said to tell them everything and offer whatever help they needed." The younger man stepped forward last, extending his hand to Jack with obvious emotion. "I'm David Hartwell. Thomas was my great-uncle. My family has been searching for information about what happened to them since 1956. As the group gathered around the marker stones, Jack felt the supernatural presences growing stronger, as if the arrival of living relatives had somehow amplified their ability to manifest. Rex moved between the visitors, his tail wagging with renewed energy, acting as if he were introducing old friends. Jack realized that what had started as his personal journey toward healing had become something much larger, a mission to restore dignity to the forgotten dead and provide closure to families who had carried questions across generations. The revelation came to Jack in the quiet hours after the relatives had left, when he was alone in his hotel room, going through Sarah's belongings for the first time since her death. He had brought only one box with him to Millbrook, items too precious to leave behind, but too painful to face. Now, surrounded by the evidence of lives cut short and stories that demanded telling, he finally found the courage to open it. Sarah's reading glasses were on top, still folded in their case. Beneath them, her favorite bookmark marked a page in a historical research journal. Below that, a manila folder labeled Frontier Families Project in Sarah's careful handwriting. Jack's hands trembled as he opened it, unprepared for what he would find inside. The first document was a letter from the Colorado Historical Society, dated 6 months before Sarah's death, thanking her for her inquiry regarding the Hartwell family disappearance of 1955. The second was a photocopy of a newspaper article from the Denver Post, dated January 1956, with a handwritten note in Sarah's writing, 3 family members listed as missing, why no follow-up stories. But it was the third document that made Jack's world tilt on its axis. It was a hand-drawn map, clearly created by Sarah, showing the route from their cabin to various historical sites she had planned to visit. At the center of the map, circled in red ink, was Millbrook. Next to it, Sarah had written, "Possible winter shelter location, check church records." Jack's vision blurred as the implications crashed over him. Sarah had been researching the Hartwell family. She had planned to visit Millbrook. The intersection where she and Emma had died in the blizzard 3 years ago was on the original road that led to this ghost town. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and called Martha. Not caring that it was nearly midnight, "Martha, I need to ask you something important. The road that leads to Millbrook, was it ever different? Did it follow a different route years ago?" Martha's voice was alert despite the late hour. "Yes, the main road was rerouted in the 1960s when they built the new highway. The original road came up from the south through Willow Creek Pass. Why?" Jack closed his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. "That's where my wife and daughter died, Martha. 3 years ago in a blizzard. They were on the old Willow Creek Pass road." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of impossible coincidence that felt too deliberate to be chance. "Jack," Martha said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "bring me Sarah's research. Bring it all. There are things about that intersection, about that particular stretch of road, that you need to know." The drive to Cedar Ridge at midnight should have been treacherous, but Jack felt as if he were being guided by invisible hands. Rex sat beside him, more alert than he'd been in days, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he too understood that they were approaching answers that had been waiting years to be revealed. Martha's house was a small Victorian that glowed with warm light in every window. She met them at the door in her bathrobe, her face grave, with the weight of secrets she was finally ready to share. "I should have told you sooner," she said, as they settled in her kitchen. "But I needed to be sure you were strong enough to handle it. The intersection where your family died, it's not the first tragedy there. It's the place where the Hartwell family should have turned around, should have headed back to safety instead of pushing on to Millbrook." She spread Sarah's research on the kitchen table, alongside documents Jack had never seen before. Weather reports from December 1955, a hand-drawn map showing the exact location where the Hartwell family's wagon had been found abandoned. And most shocking of all, a list of accidents that had occurred at that same intersection over the decades since. 17 accidents in 60 years, Martha said quietly. Most of them during winter storms, most of them involving families with children. It's as if something keeps drawing people to that spot during the worst possible weather. Jack stared at the list, seeing his family's names at the bottom in Martha's careful handwriting. "You think the Hartwells are somehow—" "I think they're trying to save people," Martha interrupted. "I think they've been trying to warn families away from making the same mistake they made. But something about that intersection, maybe the way the roads curve, maybe the way the wind patterns work, makes it almost impossible to turn back once you've committed to the route." Jack looked down at Sarah's research, seeing it now with new understanding. His wife hadn't just been studying historical disappearances. She had been following a trail that led directly to the intersection where she would die, drawn by the same mysterious force that had been operating for decades. "There's more," Martha said, pulling out one final document. "Your wife called me 2 days before her death. She wanted to arrange a visit to Millbrook, said she had questions about the Hartwell family that she couldn't answer through research alone. I told her to wait until spring, that the winter roads were too dangerous. She said she understood, but that she felt compelled to at least drive past the old turnoff, just to see where the original road began." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Jack felt as if he was standing at the edge of an abyss, staring down at truths too large for his mind to fully grasp. "You're saying Sarah was called there? The same way I was called to buy Millbrook?" Martha nodded slowly. "I think the Hartwell family has been reaching across time, trying to bring the right person to their story. Someone who would understand loss, who would have the resources and determination to set things right. Your wife was the first attempt, but the intersection claimed her instead," Jack finished, his voice hollow with the weight of understanding. "So they tried again with me." Rex whined softly and placed his head on Jack's lap, offering the only comfort he could. Jack buried his fingers in the dog's graying fur, feeling the warmth of unconditional love that had sustained him through the darkest years of his life. "There's something else you need to understand," Martha said gently. "Rex isn't just your dog, Jack. He's been your guide from the very beginning. Dogs have always been sensitive to spiritual energies, and Rex, he's been serving as a bridge between you and forces you couldn't perceive on your own, as if responding to his name." Rex lifted his head and looked directly into Jack's eyes. In that gaze, Jack saw intelligence that went beyond canine understanding, a wisdom that spoke of sacrifice and service that extended far beyond the loyalty of even the most devoted pet. "He's been dying since we arrived here," Jack said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Giving his life force to help me connect with them." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Animals like Rex, they understand things about love and sacrifice that we humans spend lifetimes trying to learn. He knows that his work here is more important than his own survival." Jack pulled Rex closer, feeling the dog's ribs beneath his fur, the way his breath came short and labored. His faithful companion, his last living connection to the life he'd shared with Sarah and Emma, was slowly fading away in service to souls he'd never met, but somehow understood needed his help. "How long does he have?" Jack asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Long enough to finish what all of you started. long enough to see the Hartwell family finally at rest. Long enough to help you understand that some kinds of love really are stronger than death. As they drove back to Millbrook in the pre-dawn darkness, Jack felt the weight of cosmic purpose settling around him like a cloak. Sarah and Emma hadn't died in a random accident. They had been caught up in something that transcended individual tragedy, part of a story that stretched across decades and demanded completion. And Rex, his faithful Rex, was giving his life to ensure that story had the ending it deserved. The plan came to Jack in pieces over the following days, as if the spirits themselves were guiding his thoughts toward the right course of action. He would create a memorial that honored not just the Hartwell family, but all the forgotten souls buried behind the church. More than that, he would ensure their stories became part of the official record, acknowledged by the community that had once tried to erase them. Jack spent his mornings sketching designs for the memorial, working at the hotel's front desk while Rex dozed in the patch of sunlight that streamed through the lobby windows. The old dog's breathing had become increasingly labored, but his presence remained a source of strength and inspiration. Sometimes Jack would look up from his drawings to find Rex watching him with eyes that seemed to say, "Yes, that's right. That's what they need." The memorial would be simple but dignified, a granite monument inscribed with the names of all 11 souls they had identified, surrounded by individual markers for each grave. At the center would be a bronze plaque telling the true story of what had happened during the Christmas blizzard of 1955. Ensuring that future visitors would understand both the tragedy and the decades-long injustice that followed. But first, Jack needed support from the living community, and that proved more challenging than dealing with the dead. His first stop was the Cedar Ridge Town Council, where he presented his proposal during the monthly public meeting. The reaction was immediately divided. Younger council members like Sarah Peterson and Michael Chang were enthusiastic about acknowledging the historical injustice and creating a memorial that could attract visitors interested in frontier history. The older members were less receptive. "Mr. Brennan," said Council Chairman Harold Wickham, a man in his 70s whose grandfather had been mayor during the cover-up, "I appreciate your passion for this project, but we need to consider the potential negative impact on our community's reputation. Tourism is important to our economy. Tourists come to see authentic history," Jack replied, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "They come to honor the courage of frontier families, not to pretend those families never existed. But do they come to hear about children dying of starvation? About town officials covering up deaths?" Wickham's voice carried the weight of generational defensiveness. "Some stories are better left buried, Mr. Brennan." The phrase hit Jack like a slap. Some stories are better left buried. The same justification used 68 years ago, still echoing in the voices of those who prioritized comfort over truth. Eleanor Walsh, who had attended the meeting at Jack's invitation, stood slowly from her seat in the audience. At 87, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had lived long enough to see many injustices, but still possessed the strength to fight them. "My brother, James, was 19 years old when he disappeared," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "For 70 years, my family has wondered what happened to him. We held memorial services without a body to bury. We grieved without closure, imagined scenarios that were probably worse than the truth. Mr. Brennan has given us the gift of finally knowing where James rests, and you want to keep that gift hidden because it might make tourists uncomfortable." Her words seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere. Jack watched as several council members exchanged glances, their expressions softening with what might have been recognition of their own mortality, their own family's vulnerabilities. But it was David Hartwell's testimony that truly changed the dynamic. Thomas Hartwell's great-nephew had driven down from Wyoming for the meeting, bringing with him a folder of family photographs and documents that painted a vivid picture of the lives that had been lost. "My great-uncle Thomas was a good man," David said, his voice thick with emotion. He worked hard, loved his family, contributed to every community he lived in. My great-aunt Margaret was a piano teacher who gave free lessons to children whose families couldn't afford them. Lucy was a bright, curious little girl who wrote stories and drew pictures of the mountain she loved. He held up a photograph that made several people in the audience gasp. It was Lucy, smiling and gap-toothed, holding a puppy that looked remarkably like a young Rex. They don't deserve to be remembered as a cautionary tale or a source of shame. They deserve to be honored for who they were. A family that faced the worst possible circumstances with courage and love. If we can't honor that, what does that say about us as a community? The council voted 4-3 in favor of supporting Jack's memorial project, with Chairman Wickham casting the deciding vote after a long moment of internal struggle. "I suppose," he said quietly, "that my grandfather's generation made enough mistakes. Perhaps it's time for my generation to make different choices." But community approval was only the first battle. As word of the memorial project spread through Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountain communities, opposition began to organize. A group calling itself the Mountain Heritage Preservation Society started a petition to block the memorial, claiming it would sensationalize tragedy for commercial purposes and damage the region's family-friendly tourism image. The group's leader was Rebecca Thurston, whose great-grandfather had been one of the original town council members involved in the cover-up. She appeared on local radio shows and wrote letters to regional newspapers, arguing that dredging up old sorrows serves no constructive purpose. Jack found himself in the unfamiliar position of being a public figure, fielding calls from reporters and historians who had been drawn to the story. Most were supportive, recognizing the historical and human importance of acknowledging the Hartwell family's fate. But the controversy was taking a toll on his energy and his focus. It was during this period of public scrutiny that Rex's condition deteriorated dramatically. The old dog had been moving slowly for weeks, but one morning Jack found him unable to get to his feet. Rex's breathing was shallow and labored, his eyes still bright but his body clearly failing. Jack carried him to the veterinarian in Cedar Ridge, knowing what he would be told, but needing to hear it anyway. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan," Dr. Jennifer Hayes said after her examination. "His heart is giving out and there are signs of organ failure. At his age, there's really nothing we can do except keep him comfortable. I'd estimate he has days, maybe a week at most." Jack's hands shook as he stroked Rex's graying fur. The dog looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only the same steady devotion that had sustained them both through 3 years of grief and healing. "Can I take him home?" "Of course. Just keep him warm and comfortable, and call me when you need me to come out." The drive back to Millbrook was quiet, except for Rex's labored breathing and the sound of Jack's tears hitting the steering wheel. His last living connection to his old life, his faithful companion, who had somehow understood the spiritual work they were meant to do together, was leaving him just as their mission was reaching its crucial moment. That evening, Jack sat in the church with Rex, lying on a bed of blankets beside the altar. The memorial plans were spread around them, along with the artifacts they had discovered together. Lucy's music box, the carved cross, the photographs, the secret markers. As the sun set through the stained glass windows, the familiar presences began to gather. Lucy appeared first, her golden light brighter than Jack had ever seen it. She seemed to hover near Rex, her ethereal form pulsing with gratitude and love. The other spirits followed, her parents, James Walsh, the unknown souls whose names were carved on hidden stones, all of them focused on the dying dog who had served as their bridge to the living world. "He's been with us all along," came Lucy's voice, clearer now than it had ever been. "Ever since he was a puppy, he could see us, hear us, understand us. When you needed him most, we guided him to you. And when we needed someone to hear our story, he brought you to us." Jack reached out to touch Rex's side, feeling the slowing rhythm of his heartbeat. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you needed to choose this path for yourself," Thomas Hartwell's deeper voice answered. Love can't be forced, Mr. Brennan. It can only be offered and accepted. Rex has been offering his love to both the living and the dead. And now his work is nearly finished. Jack looked around the church at the assembled spirits, no longer frightening or mysterious, but simply souls who had been waiting decades for acknowledgement and peace. Tomorrow, construction would begin on the memorial. In 2 weeks, the dedication ceremony would take place, with relatives, historians, and community members gathering to finally honor lives that had been hidden too long. But tonight was about saying goodbye to the faithful friend who had made it all possible. "Thank you," Jack whispered to Rex, his voice breaking on the words. "For everything. For staying with me, for bringing me here, for showing me that love really doesn't end." Rex's tail moved once against the blankets, a final gesture of acknowledgement. As Jack held his dying companion, surrounded by the grateful spirits of the forgotten dead, he understood that some sacrifices are so profound they transcend the boundary between life and death, creating bridges that allow healing to flow both ways across the divide. The memorial would be built, the stories would be told, and the forgotten souls would finally find peace. But the greatest monument to love's endurance was the old border collie who had given his life to serve a cause larger than himself, teaching a broken man that true healing comes not from escaping grief, but from transforming it into service to others. The memorial dedication ceremony began at sunrise on a crisp October morning, 3 weeks after Jack had first heard Lucy's laughter echoing through the empty church. More than 200 people had gathered in Millbrook, relatives of the forgotten dead, historians, community members, and reporters who had been drawn to the story of love transcending decades of silence. Jack stood at the podium that had been erected beside the new granite monument, his prepared speech forgotten as he looked out at faces that reflected his own journey from grief to purpose. Eleanor Walsh sat in the front row, her hands folded over a photograph of her brother James. David Hartwell was there with his extended family, 3 generations who had finally learned what happened to Thomas, Margaret, and Lucy. Martha Henley wiped tears from her eyes as she held hands with Dr. Morrison's grandson, both of them representing the courage it takes to confront family secrets. But it was Rex who commanded Jack's attention. The old dog lay on a blanket beside the podium, his breathing so shallow that each rise and fall of his chest seemed like a miracle. Jack had carried him there that morning, knowing it would likely be the last journey they would take together. Rex's eyes remained bright and alert, fixed on something just beyond what human vision could perceive. "Friends," Jack began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we gather here not to mourn the dead, but to celebrate lives that refuse to be forgotten. The people buried in this ground were pioneers, dreamers, workers who came west seeking better lives for themselves and their families. They deserve better than unmarked graves and 70 years of silence." As he spoke, the air around the memorial began to shimmer with the same ethereal energy Jack had learned to recognize. But this time, the supernatural manifestation was visible to more than just him and Rex. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people pointed at patches of golden light that seemed to dance between the headstones. Eleanor Walsh gasped and pressed her hand to her heart. "James," she whispered, her voice audible in the sudden hush. "Oh, my dear boy, you're here." The golden lights grew brighter, more defined, until even the most skeptical observers could no longer deny what they were seeing. The spirits of the forgotten dead had come to witness their own recognition. Their forms shimmering like heat mirages, but unmistakably present. Lucy appeared first, her small figure glowing with joy as she moved between the headstones that now bore proper inscriptions. Her parents flanked her, their ethereal hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture of protective love that had endured beyond death. James Walsh stood beside his marker, young and strong as he had been in life, his eyes fixed on his elderly sister with an expression of infinite tenderness. But it was the sight of Rex that brought Jack to his knees beside the podium. The old dog was no longer alone on his blanket. Surrounding him were the spirits of other animals, dogs, cats, horses, creatures that had served as bridges between the human and spirit worlds throughout the decades. They pressed close to Rex with obvious affection and respect, acknowledging a brother who had given everything in service to love. Rex lifted his graying head with obvious effort, his tail managing one final wag as he looked at Jack. In that gaze was everything they had shared, the years of grief, the journey to healing, the discovery of purpose larger than personal pain. Rex's eyes held no sadness, only the deep satisfaction of a job well done and a love that had been perfectly expressed. "Thank you, old friend," Jack whispered, his voice breaking as he stroked Rex's head. "Thank you for showing me the way home." Rex's breathing grew slower, more labored. The assembled crowd watched in reverent silence as the supernatural presences gathered more closely around the dying dog, their golden light seeming to flow into him like a benediction. Lucy knelt beside Rex's blanket, her small ethereal hand resting on his head in a gesture of blessing and farewell. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, casting long shadows between the memorial stones, Rex drew his final breath. It came softly, peacefully, with no struggle or distress, simply the gentle release of a soul whose work was complete. The moment Rex's spirit left his body, the entire memorial site blazed with light. The assembled crowd gasped as every supernatural presence became clearly visible. No longer shadowy impressions, but fully manifested souls standing in the bright Colorado sunshine. They formed a circle around Rex's still form, their faces radiant with gratitude and love. Jack felt arms around him, not physical embraces, but the spiritual presence of every soul Rex had helped cross between worlds. Sarah's touch, Emma's laughter, the Hartwell family's profound thanks, the peaceful acknowledgement of the forgotten dead who could finally rest knowing their stories had been told. In that moment of overwhelming spiritual communion, Jack understood the full scope of what had been accomplished. Rex had given his life not just to help forgotten souls find peace, but to teach a broken man that love's true expression lies in service to others, that healing comes not from escaping grief, but from transforming it into something that benefits the world. The light began to fade as the spirits prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited souls at peace. But their gratitude lingered in the air like a blessing, and Jack knew that Rex's sacrifice had created something eternal, a bridge between love and service that would endure long after the last witness to this miracle had passed away. As the supernatural light began to fade, Jack found himself standing before a crowd transformed by what they had witnessed. Where moments before there had been skeptics and curiosity seekers, now there were believers, people whose lives had been forever changed by encountering love that transcended death. Eleanor Walsh approached the memorial stone bearing her brother's name, her weathered hands tracing the carved letters with infinite tenderness. 70 years, she whispered. 70 years I wondered if he was alone when he died. Now I know he wasn't alone at all. David Hartwell gathered his extended family around the Hartwell monument, 3 generations finally able to honor ancestors they had thought were lost forever. His teenage grandson placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone, while his elderly aunt wept tears that seemed to wash away decades of unanswered questions. But it was the transformation in the community members that struck Jack most profoundly. Harold Wickham, the council chairman who had initially opposed the memorial, stood with tears streaming down his face as he stared at the inscription that told the true story of what had happened in 1955. "My grandfather was wrong," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "They were all wrong. Some stories aren't meant to be buried, they're meant to be honored." Jack lifted Rex's still form in his arms, feeling the weight of his faithful companion one last time. The old dog seemed to be sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed in an expression of deep contentment. Around them, the crowd began to form a spontaneous procession, following Jack as he carried Rex toward a spot he had prepared beneath an old oak tree that overlooked the memorial site. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, The veterinarian who had driven out from Cedar Ridge helped Jack lower Rex into the grave that had been dug earlier that morning. But before they could begin filling it with earth, Lucy's spirit appeared one final time, kneeling beside the grave with arms full of ethereal flowers that seemed to be made of pure light. "For the bravest soul I ever knew," she said, her child's voice somehow audible to everyone present. She placed the spirit flowers on Rex's chest, and they seemed to sink into his fur, becoming part of him in a way that defied physical laws. Other spirits followed Lucy's example. James Walsh laid what appeared to be a ghostly walking stick beside Rex, a symbol of the journey they had taken together. Thomas and Margaret Hartwell offered their own tributes, and gradually the grave was filled not with earth, but with tokens of gratitude from souls who had found peace through Rex's sacrifice. As the ceremony continued, Martha stepped forward with something Jack hadn't expected, a bronze plaque she had commissioned in secret. It bore Rex's name and dates, along with an inscription that brought fresh tears to Jack's eyes. Rex Brennan, faithful companion, spiritual bridge, teacher of love without limits. "Every hero deserves recognition," Martha said simply, as helpers installed the plaque on a granite marker that would stand as Rex's permanent memorial. Jack spoke then, not from notes or preparation, but from a heart overflowing with gratitude and understanding. He told the assembled crowd about Rex's journey from a simple farm dog to a spiritual bridge who had helped both the living and the dead find peace. He spoke of loyalty that transcended species, of love that refused to be limited by the boundary between life and death. "Rex taught me that healing doesn't come from forgetting," Jack said, his voice growing stronger as he found his purpose in the words. "It comes from remembering with love instead of pain. It comes from taking our grief and transforming it into service to others. It comes from understanding that every soul matters, every story deserves to be told, every love deserves to be honored." The crowd responded with a silence so profound it seemed to echo across the mountains. In that quietness, Jack felt the presence of every soul Rex had helped, not just the forgotten dead of Millbrook, but Sarah and Emma, whose love had guided him here, whose spirits had worked through Rex to heal a broken man and restore justice to the abandoned. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, many approached Jack with their own stories of loss and healing. A widow from Denver spoke of dreams about her deceased husband that had brought her comfort. A veteran from Colorado Springs described seeing his fallen comrades in moments of crisis, guiding him towards safety. A mother who had lost a child shared her conviction that love truly does survive death, expressing itself through signs and synchronicities that skeptics dismiss but believers treasure. Each conversation confirmed what Jack had learned through his own journey. Rex's sacrifice had not just helped the spirits of Millbrook find peace, but had opened a door for the living to acknowledge and honor their own connections to the world beyond death. As the last visitor departed and the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jack stood alone beside Rex's grave, feeling not empty but fulfilled. His faithful companion had given everything to serve a cause larger than himself, and in doing so had taught a grieving man that the highest expression of love is not in holding on, but in letting go with grace and transforming loss into service to others. The memorial was complete. The stories had been told, and the forgotten souls were finally at rest. But Rex's true monument would live on in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed his sacrifice and learned from his example that love, properly understood, recognizes no boundaries and acknowledges no limits. 6 months later, Jack Brennan stood at the window of what had once been Millbrook's abandoned hotel, now transformed into a visitor center and museum dedicated to the stories of frontier families who had found both triumph and tragedy in the Colorado mountains. The spring morning was crisp and clear, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and amber that made the ghost town look less like a place of abandonment and more like a sanctuary of memory. The changes had come gradually but steadily throughout the winter. Historians from the University of Colorado had established a research partnership to document other forgotten stories from the region's mining era. The Colorado Historical Society had provided funding for proper preservation of the buildings and artifacts. Most surprisingly, descendants of families who had lost members in the mountains over the decades had begun making pilgrimages to Millbrook, seeking the same kind of closure that had brought peace to the Hartwells and the Walshes. Jack had become, almost by accident, the town's unofficial curator and guide. He lived simply in the restored hotel, maintaining the memorial, leading tours for visitors, and helping other families research their own lost relatives. It was work that filled him with purpose, in a way that his years of isolated grieving never could have achieved. The transformation in his own appearance reflected the change in his spirit. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for 3 years was gone, replaced by the quiet contentment of someone who had found meaningful work. His hair had grown longer, streaked with grey that spoke of wisdom rather than worry. His hands, once restless with unresolved grief, now moved with the steady confidence of someone who had learned to channel pain into purpose. But it was the arrival of the puppy that had completed his healing in a way he never could have anticipated. She had appeared on a snowy February morning, a small golden retriever mix with bright eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. Jack had found her sleeping against Rex's headstone, as if she had been guided there by forces beyond human understanding. When he approached, she had looked up at him with an expression of such pure joy and recognition that his heart had nearly burst with the realization that love truly does find a way to perpetuate itself. He had tried to find her owners, posting notices and calling shelters throughout the region. But as days turned to weeks and no one claimed her, Jack began to understand that she hadn't been lost. She had been sent. The puppy, whom he eventually named Hope, possessed an uncanny ability to comfort grieving visitors, often appearing at their sides during emotional moments at the memorial with the same intuitive wisdom that Rex had shown. Martha visited every few weeks, bringing new research and updates on other families who had found answers through the Millbrook project. Eleanor Walsh had become a regular correspondent, sending letters filled with stories about her brother James that she had finally been able to share after decades of silence. David Hartwell had established a small scholarship fund in his family's name, providing aid to students researching frontier history. But it was the letter Jack received in early spring that truly confirmed the lasting impact of what had been accomplished in Millbrook. It came from Rebecca Thurston, the woman who had led the opposition to the memorial project. "Dear Mr. Brennan," it read, "I owe you an apology that is long overdue. My great-grandfather's journals came to light after his house was sold, and I finally learned the truth about what happened in 1955. The guilt he carried for his part in covering up the Hartwell family's death consumed him for the rest of his life. He wrote repeatedly about hearing voices in the wind and seeing shadows that looked like children. I understand now that he wasn't losing his mind. He was being haunted by the consequences of his choices. Thank you for giving those souls the peace that my great-grandfather's actions denied them." The memorial is beautiful, and the story needed to be told. On this particular spring morning, Jack was expecting a special group of visitors, a family from Oregon whose ancestor had worked in the Millbrook mine in the early 1900s before disappearing during a cave-in. They had contacted him through the museum's website, hoping to learn more about their relative's fate and possibly add his name to the memorial if evidence of his burial could be found. As he prepared for their arrival, Jack reflected on the profound changes that had transformed his understanding of loss and healing. 3 years ago, he had been a man broken by tragedy, isolated by grief, convinced that love was a liability that only led to unbearable pain. Now he understood that love was actually the strongest force in existence, capable of transcending death itself and creating connections that stretched across generations. Rex had been the teacher who helped him learn this lesson. sacrificing his own life to demonstrate that true love expresses itself through service to others. The old dog's legacy lived on, not just in the memorial he had helped create, but in every family that found closure through their work. Every visitor who left Millbrook with a deeper appreciation for the persistence of love. Every person who learned that grief could be transformed into something that honored rather than diminished the memory of those who had passed. Hope trotted into the room, carrying in her mouth a small piece of wood that had been carved into the shape of a heart. Jack had no idea where she had found it, but he wasn't surprised by her discovery. Millbrook still held secrets, still revealed gifts to those who approached it with open hearts and patient spirits. "What did you find, girl?" Jack asked, taking the carved heart from her mouth and examining it in the morning light. On one side was carved Emma in a child's careful script. On the other side was "For Papa" in letters that made Jack's breath catch in his throat, his daughter's final gift, hidden away and waiting for the right moment to be discovered. A reminder that love creates artifacts that survive even the most devastating losses. That every act of love leaves its mark on the world in ways that can't always be immediately perceived. As Jack held his daughter's carving and watched Hope's tail wag with the pure joy of successful treasure hunting, he understood that his journey had come full circle. He had arrived in Millbrook as a broken man seeking silence, but he had found something far more valuable. The knowledge that love never truly dies. It simply transforms itself into new expressions of service, connection, and hope. Outside, the sound of car engines announced the arrival of his morning visitors, another family seeking answers about their own lost loved ones. Jack tucked Emma's heart carefully into his pocket, called Hope to his side, and walked toward the door to greet them, ready to help other souls discover what he had learned. That in the vast landscape of human experience, love always finds a way to bridge the distance between heartbreak and healing.